Okay, so brief introductions from me. So our moderator for today's panel session is John Mancini. John is the president of AIM. And I want to tell you a little bit about AIM. AIM is a very special organization in the PDF space. AIM is the organization that hosts a secretariat for ISO's TC-171. What does that mean? It means that AIM is the organization that managed the process of bringing the various PDF standards into the ISO world. Beginning with PDF-A, starting I believe in 2001, and then continuing with PDF-UA. That project began in 2004. It only actually got published in 2012. That's the kind of time frame that it requires to be able to think in terms of developing sophisticated software standards. And AIM has had a long tradition of working with standards development in the ECM space. So we're very pleased to have John here, who's to be moderating this panel and to be grilling our three federal employee experts here who are here to talk about these very subjects. So on your far right is Mark Patrick. For over 7 years, Mark has been responsible for records management program of the Joint Staff and 9 combatant commands on behalf of the Chairman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His 30-person division manages the official corporate record archive for the top 5, the Joint Staff, the Chairman, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Assistant to the Chairman, Director, and Vice Director. The Information Management Division portfolio includes research for current business, e-discovery, knowledge services, information governance policy, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act program, automatic declassification, policy and forms program management. In the middle, you see Stephen Levenson. Steve was instrumental. We can't mention his agency for all kinds of very good reasons. Steve was instrumental in the development of the electronic record system in use in the federal courts, having brought the concept from the court over 30 years ago. He's a wealth of experience in bringing paper systems into the digital realm while addressing concerns of provenance, authenticity, rendering, interface with workflow, and long-term preservation. And closest to me, on your left, is Kevin DeVorsey, Supervisory Electronic Records Format Specialist in the Policy, Analysis, and Enforcement Division of Agency Services at the National Archives and Records Administration. That would be NARA. Wow, that's a long title, Kevin. Kevin's located in New York City, and he directs a team that's responsible for developing guidance that defines the electronic formats that are appropriate for use in by federal agencies transferring permanent records to NARA. And you may have heard both Stephen and Kevin had presentations at PDF Day earlier today. So without further ado, I turn it over to John Mancini. John?
Sure, thank you, Duff. Really glad to be here today. Duff's a little modest. Duff is also on the International Board of Directors of AIM. He is also chairman of our standards board. And as Duff said, AIM is the organization that basically is the secretariat for all those fine PDF acronyms that you guys have been bandying about during the course of the day today. I'd like to thank Adobe and AdLib and Actuate and PDFtron and Crawford. They're members of the association. The rest of you vendors should be. I'll be hitting you up later on for that. So thank you for being members. We really do appreciate it. We do have couple of folks from our chapter here. If you're looking for locally based activities to get connected to, Jack Frost and Carol Keek and Mark Patrick and Steve Levenson are very involved in the local chapter here. Terrific networking opportunities. As Duff said, we have been in the document space since it was microfilm. So I mean, we've been in this space a long time, focusing on the intersection between documents and business processes is really at the heart of what AIM is all about. And Mark and Duff are currently on the International Board of Directors right now. Steve is a past member of the board, but more importantly, these two guys are on the board now, which means they're technically my boss. So fill out the evaluations, rank this session very highly, you know, all that kind of good stuff. So let me start. And also, feel free to just raise your hands, interrupt. We're going to try to keep this. It's late in the day. We'd like to keep this as interactive as we possibly can. So if you have questions, just put your hand up. We'll run the mic around. And we've got 3 very senior federal government people here, and it's kind of unusual to have this much talent on one dais. And so any questions that you want to ask, again, feel free. My job is to facilitate, not to dominate here. So I wanted to start with maybe a perspective question. And You guys look a little too young maybe to answer this question, but give it a shot anyway. Is that we've all been doing this document thing for a long time. And so look back 15, 20 years. Think about where your agencies were with regards to managing documents then, and what's different now, what's better, what's worse, what do you struggle with, what are your big achievements? Maybe start over from Mark and kind of go my left to the right over here.
So the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was Omar Bradley. I was not on the joint staff then. We're on our 18th now. And basically the paper document workflow process that existed in the early days of the joint staff in the mid-'80s became a kludged together Microsoft workflow process that had an archival tool. In 2008, we upgraded to a combination of Metastorm and Documentum as our 5015 compliant undercarriage for the official workflow of the staff. We moved probably, staff's about 3,000 people supporting the top 5. We move 6,000 to 9,000 actions a year, depending on what hotspots are going on. So you can see that we've come, take some recent leaps. We're currently looking at upgrading to Alfresco, so an open source with a different web flow, and that's heavily in work right now. So that's where we've gone. That piece is pretty good. I'm very happy with that. It's all the SharePoint and shared drives and federal cloud stuff that is of concern to me, is managing that stuff for e-discovery, regular business use, etc. That's kind of where we are.
What particular issues with regards to that are of concern to you?
Well,
other than
couple
just the
different
mess.
things. For e-discovery, it's a mess. It's a lot of information. My sense is that there are senior IT people in the Department of Defense that don't really see the value that they can mine from that information. So the software associated with that, getting it under management is not something that's a high priority in a sequestration environment. And with all the other things that are going on in the world, there's a much more focus on consolidating data centers and cybersecurity than there is in creating value from our information.
Steve, we said we're not at liberty to divulge your agency, so it must be NSA, so we'll keep it all secret amongst ourselves here, but it's not really. But give us your sense of what's changed in your world.
No, there is no secrecy over where I work. Actually, I work for the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts, but I'm not representing them today. I've taken annual leave to come over here, so it's just easier. There's less paperwork. That's the only reason. I really I have a little different perspective on where we are and what we've done, and I take us back to 1782 when the Judiciary Bill was signed, and the way that we did business back then. And we asked, we're the independent record keeper, the courts are the independent record keeper for this branch of the government. And the things that we did back then and the things that we do now are really not that much different. I mean, as we evolved and we got these technologies like tab office products that had a folder with ACO fasteners in it, and we began to set rules for the lawyers that said, oh, the fasteners are on the top, so bring your top margin down 3 inches when you give us papers, because when it gets really thick, we can't read it when we get into these really thick folders. We've always had a relationship with our suppliers, our document suppliers, and what the technologies were that we were presenting in. And now we move into the PDF world, the digital world, and we're doing the same thing. We're turning to our suppliers of documents and we're saying, we need it in PDF and PDFA format, and this is what we need to do to continue our role as an independent record keeper as we move through to the next generations. And these are the things that we're going to do the same things we did in 1782. We're going to continue to do that through. So I have a little different perspective on this, that I really don't see what we're doing except adapting to new technologies and trying to keep that mission in front of us as to what we're attempting to do.
I spoke earlier about NARA's transfer guidance, and I think if I had to say what has changed, I guess a story that I would tell to try and shine a light on it is we've been bringing in electronic records since the late 60s, and I spoke that for decades, electronic records, mainframe data coming from DOD or US Census or the IRS, And I guess there's been this expectation that there's this tidal wave of Word documents, WordPerfect documents, and things coming. Last year, I visited an agency as part of a site visit, and they were asking a lot of questions about video files and audio formats because they wanted to transfer these records. And so we went back and forth, and they gave us some sample files, and there was a lot of discussion. And at the end, I asked them, what have you been doing? And up until this point, they have been submitting paper transcripts of these meetings because that was the record. So it's really today that regardless of what the record type is, the electronic version is being recognized as being the record. So the tidal wave you might have expected 10 years ago is really hitting now, where paper through legislation, HR 1233 was passed, signed last week, which redefines what a record is and pushes to, if you have paper and electronic, give the National Archives the electronic copy. And in 2011, there was a presidential directive on records management. So it really is just today that the move is, paper, there's paper still around, there's lots and lots of paper, but it really is about electronic records today.
While you have the mic, you want to talk a little bit about progress towards that 2011 memorandum?
So this, for me, in my world, this was a huge thing. It was a presidential directive on records management. You're in an agency, so you can probably give a different perspective on it. But it's the White House and the Office of Management and Budget coming out with this thing to try and encourage better records management. And it covers a wide range of issues, pushing agencies to manage electronic records better, have records keeping systems. There's also a part we're working with to develop a records management job series, which is a first. There is no job series in the U.S. government for records management, but we're working to improve that. And part of it was direct engagement with the vendor community to improve records management. So it's a pretty big deal, and NARA trying to help improve the status quo and ensure that electronic records can be preserved for as long as they're needed.
So budgets are tight. Everybody pretty much acknowledges that process automation can save money. Everybody pretty much acknowledges that PDF is critical to process automation. And yet, at least it's been my experience, and I'd be interested in yours, that this stuff is still pretty hard to get adopted. Why is that? What are we all collectively doing wrong?
We actually have a success story, and I'm working on a project right now in Chicago. We've got about 3 million images that we're going to do in the Chicago probation office. We're going to backfile convert, and we're actually going to take these officers and we're going to send them out in the field, and we're going to shrink their footprint in their rent space. The ROI on it is $1 million the first year to move them out and put them in hoteling space and other things. And we think that the product we're going to get is going to be better because they're going to interface with their customers better.
That's $1 million a year just on the rent space?
Rent space, yeah. We get $1 million on that, and that's because what's not matured over time has been the case management systems. We've done the documents, but we haven't had the case management systems that surround that. And so we've now got a case management system that's at the maturity that an officer can go to somebody's house, and that device in their hand, they can check the tag of that automobile that they see over there they're suspicious of, and see if it's a wanted felon or something. They can pull if they ask to travel, they can prepare that document on their tablet, send it to their supervisor, do the workflow, get all the things done that they need to do. They can do it remotely now. So I see that we're slowly going to begin to be able to take advantage and to cash in on some of these systems that we're using, and we're going to do that with probation across the country. So we're going to be looking at some return now on this. Now that's not suitable for the clerks of court, but it's suitable for probation.
So your take is that the missing ingredient up till now has been the case management software to essentially pull all this together.
Where can you continue to do your business process and this fit in?
Okay.
Where does it help you?
Kevin, do you have a perspective?
For years and years at the National Archives, the part of NARA I work in, I think it's policy analysis and enforcement. But in terms of enforcement, we don't have guns or badges or anything like that to go out to agencies. And for years, we've worked under a framework where we tell agencies what we want and when we want it, but we don't tell them how to do it or why. And I think the presidential directive in HR 1233 changed that a little bit, where we're engaging more directly and providing a little bit more of the how and the why to assist. And so in that situation where we say, we want your permanent records and you should give them to us in 5 years or 10 years, it's kind of the wild, wild west out there in terms of agencies. You know, they're very focused on meeting their own unique business needs. And so if we were to say, you know, we only take this format, then there's going to be lots of really good records that aren't in that format. And, I think we've done our best to try and encourage, adoption of specific types of things. The previous transfer guidance identified 14 formats, and it was a logjam because there was a lot of good stuff that wasn't in those 14 formats. Now we've expanded to 55 formats, and we'll see, does that help shift things and make it easier for agencies to adopt better or good formats? We'll see.
Mark, how about on your side?
So I said that there is that formal piece that we're doing okay with, but I think the real issue with DoD is that it's huge, 3 million plus people, and it's islands of IT and lots of money being spent, and the leadership that just doesn't see this as high enough out of the noise for them to act on it. So you end up having to work it at more of the working level. And the problem is that information managers or information professionals, it's not a very well-developed thing in the federal government as opposed to what it really needs to be, where it's a cross-functional thing with legal and security and everybody all sort of working in a collaborative way. And that's just not how the organization is used to working. So it's requiring things out of the people that work in information that's not in their position description. You have to know to get up, and you have to, if you have a vendor come in, you have to get a group of stakeholders around the table that aren't generally working together every day. And so that culture slows down improvement, because this is kind of hit or miss. And I would assume that there's some of that goes on across the federal government. So affecting change, which requires all that cooperation in organizations that have not built that collaborative infrastructure. So it's kind of ad hoc.
I think that's a really interesting take. I had a conversation recently with a gentleman from IBM, and we were talking about selling records management solutions. And he said one of the challenges there is that in order to move forward on adoption, you almost have to assemble a negative dream team of like legal people, records people, IT people, business process people. And by the time you put all those guys in the room and try to figure out who agrees on what, it's a long haul. I mean, it's a tough road, and I think that's what you're alluding to in terms of lack of consensus at the leadership level. Questions out here? I've got lots of questions, but yes. My friend from Actuate.
Hi, I just wanted to get your opinions, drawbacks, and benefits of the Cloud First initiative.
Good question. Cloud First.
Yeah, you want to? All right. Well, if it's your private cloud, we've embraced it, but not public cloud. But we're exempt we're the judiciary, so we're exempt, and we didn't have to abide by those regulations. There's lots of issues of control. I've been in the courtroom testifying to the authenticity of a record, and I'd hate to testify that this thing was in the cloud and I don't know what happened to it, and I don't know if somebody monkeyed with it. And I mean, there's some real authenticity issues that I see for records managers if you go to the cloud for storage. Fortunately, we've not had to answer that because we've at least been able to sandbox it off in our own environment. And so we've got some controls of it. But it scares me a lot.
So Cloud First is going to be a DoD thing, Vice A Joint Staff thing. So this is, if you read the papers, you can see recently in Federal Computer Week, there was a critical article of DoD where they were not following through with their cloud strategy. Part of that is due to the transition of the CIO leadership at DoD. As you may know, if you follow DoD, Terry Takai left, and Terry Halverson is the acting DoD CIO. big portfolio, a lot going on in the world that's distracting, and again, cost is driving everything. So there is a strategy. We're behind, according to the DoD-IG. I think it's going to happen. I think the joint information environment is going to happen, which is the thing that's being described as where we're going to have these enterprise services, but it's sort of three-tiered. Again, cybersecurity, data center consolidation, and enterprise services, which from my perspective, where I care a lot about that, I see that the focus is on these other two parts. So I think it's going to happen, but it's going to be a bumpy ride. Cost will drive it. So there's relationships with Amazon forming and other folks. There's going to be efforts to bring those inside the firewall. But I think that in the end, what's sustainable cost-wise is what will move us to the cloud. So as that picture is painted for leaders in a way and in a decision cycle that they can abide by it, but we'll have to get there. So.
At the National Archives, everything Stephen said about the risks of authenticity are a huge concern for us, but then there are also very extreme benefits. I mentioned in my talk, NASA wants to give us and is giving us 2.5 petabytes of video files, and it's how do you, physically, how do you do that? We took the 2010.
Not on a thumb drive.
No, but break it down. We have to validate these files, and our motion picture curators have to go through this material. It's like, take your fastest computer, take your fastest data bus, take your fastest tape drive, and do the math. How long is it going to take for us to process that information and move it? The 2010 census, we went out to the Census Bureau with forklifts and picked up their servers and put them on a flatbed and drove them to our facility. Moving data is expensive for us, and so the benefits of having information in a Fed cloud or something where it's more of a metadata switch where we take control of it without physically having to move it, that's a big plum hanging out there. But there's a lot to be worked out that, happily it's not my area. I just deal with the file formats. But
Kevin, while you got the mic, you started touching a little while ago on transfer guidance and the new transfer guidance approach, and are you seeing that having an effect in contracts, or tell a little bit about that and just sort of the practical manifestation of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mentioned part of the problem with NARA's transfer guidance is the range of time that it has tried to cover in the past, where it was people standing up new systems where we're not going to see those records for 20 years are looking at our transfer guidance, but then also people with records from the 90s are looking at our transfer guidance, and people, it just can't cover 100 years. We revised the transfer guidance, so we went from accepting 14 formats to 55 formats, and that went into effect last January. So it's, by expanding the number of formats we take, is that going to drive purchasing? If anything, hopefully it's making it easier for agencies to comply with our guidance, because they're not forced into this very narrow funnel of formats. They have a wider range that hopefully matches their business practices, and so that's kind of a goal. I think bigger drivers for agencies are things like the update of HR 1233 and the presidential memorandum, which is encouraging adoption and management of electronic records in a different way. And so that's a bigger driver, and we're hearing from agencies, which is great. People we haven't heard from in a long time are contacting us with questions about how they can comply with these things. And so record-keeping systems, case management systems, things like that are now topics where hopefully formats, it's a little bit easier.
One of the things that I've had a lot of conversations with my colleagues at ARMA about, the Records Management Association, is the training requirement being pushed down through the agencies. How are they doing? What report card would you give on that? My boss is out constantly. I'm in the format world, so I'm a little bit removed from that. I'm not the best person to talk about that. But I know that it's been good for us to have a light shown on these things so that we can start that communication, because in talking, a lot of it is very fundamental. The shift to electronic records, as Stephen said, nothing has really changed, but people don't realize that. You had a file folder with something written in pen, the date or whatever it was. We need that analogous information today, and that's metadata.
So just giving us that digital file inside the folder without the information on the folder is a problem. So it really is that chance to train and go back to basics of what are your records? Do you have a schedule for those records? How do you manage those records? And are you in a position where in the future, when the time is right, you can give them to the National Archives?
Mark, we were talking about in the hallway, just a good jumping off point about metadata and tagging. Give us some perspectives on that.
So what I wanted to relay on that topic is if anybody is interested in it, Defense Information Systems Agency is now on version 5 of the DoD Discovery Metadata Specification. So if you are interested in this, I would encourage you to just Google that. You can find it all about the history of the Defense Discovery Metadata Standard. I'm not sure that it's being leveraged across the department as envisioned by the folks who have worked years on it, but that does exist. I would say that I wanted to thread into the training issue because from my perspective, we are compliant on the Joint Staff. My records officer has been trained, and we've got broad training that goes out in the, that people have to do online. But really where I think the victory is that we bake lifecycle management into our electronic information so that the human can work and not have to worry about all this stuff. So you had asked earlier about the non-formal workflow information, and that's the problem, is that it's not lifecycle managed. Okay, so we have responding to discoveries where subordinate commands are giving me hard drives with tens of thousands of documents that we have to turn over to the General Counsel, and the reason we have them is because they're never being deleted because they're not being properly governed in these areas outside, in these repositories outside of our formal workflow. So that's all over the place from the tagging question, but there's a defense metadata standard, and how we interact with our users with regard to tagging, say in the SharePoint environment, is that we're building in our schedule to SharePoint so that when decisions are made by the user as they save files for collaboration, they're actually checking the box for what file series that is. They don't think about that that's what they're doing, but that's how we've built out our SharePoint.
Steve, when you were on the AIM board, you were really involved in a lot of the early development of PDFA and then actually early implementation in the courts. How is that going?
Well, on the court side, we ran a test in New York Southern, and it went fine. The attorneys had no problems at all. What we've done is we've gone out, we've procured some software, and centrally, we provided for each of the courts a switch they can throw to make it mandatory. Unfortunately, we had a budget cutback that's hit us during that same period, and the traditional model that we've used to roll out technology to the lawyers is to train them, and there's nobody to train right now. So we've kind of slowed down in terms of what we're doing, but it's going to be a court-by-court individual decision. The reality is that we're accepting it today. We're just not mandating it today. So there is a lot of PDFA coming in, but it's not 100%. It's not at that level. So we've made some progress towards that, but I'd like to, of course, see more.
I think there's a need for a lot of basic education around that too in the marketplace. PDF Association has a big role to play in that as well. I know when we do seminars around the country in the fall, usually 9 cities. When I ask people, like, have they ever even heard of PDFA? There's a huge uphill climb from an education perspective in the general business community of what that's all about. Other questions out here? Carol.
What have you done in your organizations to bring the stakeholders together for long-term preservation? You have the term archiving meaning different things to the IT, to the stakeholders, and to the records officers. Do you have some examples of how you can bring people together for other organizations to mirror, or are there good examples of how you get people to the table to solve this problem?
For us, get out of your desk and go make relationships. So where we sit in, information management division in the secretariat, the IT people are in a different part of the organization. The legal people, luckily, are across the hall. They're in our office every day, practically. So you have to go and you have to build those relationships so that when things get tense, you're friends and you're going to work through the situation. Then you build an understanding, and for example, the IT folks' mind, they think of you. When a decision comes up and you're not there, they have a sense of, hey, I need the information folks in on this decision. And by building those relationships, you get that call before you find out, no, 2 weeks ago, you know, the CIO made this decision and didn't talk to you. So I recall one of the speakers we had at the Executive Leadership Council of AIM. He's an IT guy from New England, prior Navy guy, by the way, but that's neither here nor there. Basically said the people technology process thing, people's 80%, process 15%, technology 5%. And that's what I'm talking about. The 80% is the people piece, and you have to build those relationships. And it's not in your position description, but if you don't get out and do it, things are going to fall apart.
I think, and I'd like to hear from you two guys too on that equation. It's always so funny to when we talk about that, because when you think about what we all have collectively done, we've probably had the ratios about exactly reversed, like 5% people, 15% processes, 80% technology. So have you overcome that? How have you focused on building those relationships?
Well, I thought that was the best answer I've heard in a long time. That was really great. And I think that's sort of followed our model, but we've been lucky that we're a really small organization. So those relationships are some of these people, when we worked in other circumstances, we worked in shared offices with some of these people over time. And so those relationships have been, 20 and 30-year things. And so we get called to the table when these questions come up. If PDFA's mentioned, I got a call, Steve, come down to this meeting kind of thing. And that's what you've got to have in order to be there to head it off when it happens. And I think it's all about relationships as you do it. And people, they've got to understand the mission. As I gave that other answer about, we've got a mission, we're trying to accomplish that. This PFA thing, we're trying to get a certified, validated, good record done first, so that holistically we can look at this transaction and what we turn over to this guy in 30 years or 20 years has got some validity to it and some merit to it, and we didn't have to do any work to it. And the fact that we didn't touch it and we didn't do any work to it also adds to the authenticity of it. That it is the document that an attorney gave us. It's not an altered document 6 times generation that we had to go through. It is the document that we got. Here's the checksum to prove it when that transaction occurred. So that's the way we'd like to do business, and that's well understood in our organization.
I think, I'm doing policy and guidance for federal agencies. I'm kind of at the front end of the digital preservation equation, trying to help bring in stuff that is preservable for the National Archives. And, for us, it was very, very important that we understood what's going on in federal agencies, but then also work with the custodial units at the National Archives to understand what their current processes were, what problems they were having, and then meet with our internal IT staff to see what's working with our digital repository, what are the plans for the future. And we don't want to tie our guidance to any one of those. We don't just want to write guidance to support agencies. We don't just want to write it for our processing archivists, or we don't want to write it just to meet what our repository can handle. It kind of needs to cut across all of those and be practical and aspirational in equal parts. It's like, this is the ideal and we want to acknowledge that, but we also want to acknowledge what's going on in federal agencies. So it's kind of, for our guidance, we tried to create funnels to improve the majority of the records coming in. So if 80% of the records coming in, we don't have to worry about, we accept that we're going to have to focus and take out the dental picks and poke at 20% of the records that are never going to be perfect. But
good answers from all three on that one. Duff, if they're recording up there, that'd be a good blog post. I'd like to get that at some point. Other questions out here? Oh, come on, don't be so shy. These are senior federal government people. I'm dying to answer your questions.
Well, not that senior.
I've got a question. A lot of folks in this audience are involved in solutions and selling solutions. Pierce the veil a little bit, pierce the curtain. You can either approach it from a positive perspective or a negative perspective. On the other side of the table, somebody comes in to try to sell you stuff. Like, what's the best thing they can do, or best thing that they've done, or maybe conversely, what's the worst thing, without naming names, that anybody's ever done?
You got it? You got it? All right.
All right. Without sounding like an advertisement, I would love to see a lot of you guys at the AIM chapter meetings, because I think that the ideal way to softly get your information. I mean, this 4-minute thing that we drilled here, I learned a lot of stuff, and I thought I knew the market, and I learned a lot of things today. You know, the only place that people are meeting face to face. Now, there may be in the future meetups, and there may be some other technologies and so on and so forth, but ARMA's got stuff running, AIM's got stuff running. You know, try to get out a little bit more, get across that table, and informally get some of this information out, because it's getting, like Kevin said, now the stuff's starting to hit the fan, and you know, that it's really serious out there in the agencies in terms of stuff that's got to be done. I mean, to turn around to the federal government with this presidential directive and say all of a sudden, okay, now everything's got to be electronic in mail. You've got to process electronic mail, and we want that electronic mail from you, and you've got till, what is the end of this year to do it, okay? They got to be panicking out there. I mean, you know, so that, I think participation, that's the way that I would put it. And by the way, John, thank you for keeping chapters running.
Mark, you've got to have a worst story. I know you've got to have one.
No, well, I want to second what was said about AIM. Mainly, that's where I came to meet folks like you in an informal environment, and I've really appreciated that opportunity through the past years, and that's why I've stayed active. I would say for the federal government, if you haven't done business with the federal government, the first thing is be patient. Okay, so with an organization our size, it's going to take a long time. There are folks that come in their first engagement, they're trying to turn something around quickly. It's just not going to happen. So our organization is going to, you know, our contracts are going to be taken care of by an outside federal entity outside of our organization. They're probably going to have a subcontractor that's actually going to do the work with the vendor. And so that whole lash up takes a while. And then keep in mind what I said about the relationships internal to the organization. So if you're selling to me, I'm not the IT guy. So you need to convince me that you've got something that I want. Then I have to go bring the IT guys to the table who have the checkbook with regard to IT requirements. So there's this complicated set of things that have to occur. So depending on what I think, based upon our initial interactions, I'm going to say, let's just meet you and me. Let me have a good understanding of what you bring to the table. Then I'm going to decide whether it's worth fighting the fight in the fiscal environment that we're in. And I'm going to say, then we'll meet again, and this time I'm going to bring the right IT guys that I handpick, who I've built relationships, and we're going to start to work the problem set that way. So, and then, so it's a complicated thing that involves a lot of relationship building, and so that's what I throw out. If you haven't learned that already the hard way, that's what you're in for if you haven't worked in the federal space at some level. And at DoD, it's big as it gets.
Kevin.
I don't want to dispel the impression that I'm a high-level official, but I write policy, and happily I don't.
You must have heard stories
Yeah,
over there.
No, but I can give the perspective of, you know, when we're researching formats and trying to make the decision, you know, there's money involved in preserving all of the permanent records of the United States government forever, you know, and so we took our job very seriously, and I would say standards. You know, when we're looking at formats, if there are published standards, that's a good thing. You know, 100 years from now, that standard is going to be the best bet we have if we have trouble accessing a file. And so, you know, close adherence to international or national or other standards is wonderful. And I recommend that for anybody.
Good answer.
Another question. I have one more question, but we have time for a couple more out here.
To follow up on that, do you see more standards being inserted into procurements, such as the system must support PDFA or whatever? What do you see that will help you to be ingested into the procurement cycle? And what can vendors do to help that
We
happen?
put those in there now, and I think about the 5015 standard, but I don't think that we've put PDFA in anything that I'm aware of. So yes, I mean, the standards need to go into the procurement requirements. So that process is interesting. But I'll start it on that.
We've specified A for scanning, but that's about all that we've done that for. But yeah, I think that standards though are in the evaluative phase. When you look at what technologies are being brought to the table, those that adhere to standards are the ones that we evaluate high, and we reject the rest in there. We just our philosophy I mean, we're a Linux, Unix old world. Our philosophy has always been that anything new that we acquire, we want to know what the exit strategy is, because we know we're going to have to acquire something else soon. And so we try to stay with the most open product that we can. And there are proprietary solutions you have to go with, but you want to stay as little proprietary as you can, and try to stay away from their hooks as much as you can, so that if you do have to back out of it, it's possible to do it. We were burned once about 30 years ago, and we'll never do that again.
So less or more focus on standards now than 20 years ago?
Much more now. And open systems as well. Yeah.
Same for all three of you guys?
Yeah, procurement's not something that I have a good window in from my little perch in the policy world, but I agree with everything that Stephen said. And this room is PDF. I've been staring at all the different PDF specs, and just because something purports to comply with the standard doesn't mean it's going to be free of problems, but at least we stand a chance with that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so at NARA, we're trying not to be draconian and say, you must do this, because we know that that's not always going to be successful. But we try and support agencies in making good decisions and providing a range of options. So I haven't really seen that level of, are there must statements in procurement, but it'll be interesting to see in the coming years if that changes due to some of these, the presidential directive and the changing guidance that we're putting out.
Just one last thing before I turn it back to Duff. We started off talking about, looking back 10, 15 years. There's a lot of discussion about looking ahead, about what's ahead 10, 15 years. Some discussion that, is this whole notion of rendered documents, kind of passe. This will all be handled in databases, downstream. However you want to look at it, maybe just talk a little bit about how you see the future of PDF and how you see the future of the document in your organizations. Take a time frame like 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Dramatically different, about the same?
I think it's going to evolve. I mean, I look at how I fill out my leave papers now compared to how I used to, and I fill in digital fields, and if I want to see it in PDF, it can be rendered in PDF. I do think humans like to look at those kind of documents. It's just a matter of will we get away from paving the cow path and more, using digital forms that if we want to see them in something that's easier to consume for a human, that will render it a certain way. But so I think it's just going to evolve slowly.
As far as PDF is concerned, I think that we're going to see a big evolution in the forms technology, particularly as we look at things that we're looking at in the courts, for instance. We have citizens who file with us, and I know we're being taped, but it's a giant pain in the neck. They always file stuff wrong. And if you had a TurboTax type of form that you could give them that guided them so that their answers were at least constricted to the right responses that they had, we'd save staff time by having that sort of form. In other words, you have to teach. The word venue is a term of art with us. It's where did the thing occur? Ask them their home address and translate the venue for them. I mean, the world is going to become PDF forms in terms of some of that. I see a big revolution going on in there, and we're going to see a lot of progress in there. As far as what we're going to see, I think pretty much the 8.5 by 11 piece of paper is dead. It's the information age now. We're seeing that in the PDFA-3 version, where you've got your digital version, you've got your attached XML file, and you've got your content for the person, for the human readable one, and your machines are going to consume it automatically, and then you'll have your vestige for the people, for the humans that have to read it. I think that's a revolution that's about to take place, where We're not going to have the barcodes. I mean, right now, if you want to pass information along in an automated fashion, you print a barcode for people, and then somebody sits at a workstation and scans a barcode and drives this data back in again in a process. We can skip all that. We can drive this stuff automatically now, and also in surveys and collecting data out in the field, we're going to see revolutions in that. That's a lot of what I'm going to see, what I see going on in PDF at this point. Agency-wise, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But.
You know, off on a slightly different tangent, in doing our transfer guidance, you know, we work with agencies, and the way we appraise records, we don't appraise systems. So if you're using a CAD system, we're not going to bring in that system. I think it's interesting looking at PDF because it is a very common output option out of big systems, whether they're geospatial systems or CAD systems. And you know, in our transfer guidance, in different cases for different record types, we've included PDF as an option. And so we give our processing archivists something that they can go and look and see, is this a good container for this information coming from this system? So I think in a lot of cases, unless things change dramatically and all of a sudden we can bring in huge Oracle data systems or Bentley MicroStation systems, which I don't see happening, PDF is an option that is good for kind of strange types of data beyond just documents or forms. So.
Yeah, real good point, that notion of having the artifact independent of the system that created it in the first place. Yeah.
Can I make one last comment?
Yep. Last word for Steve.
All right. We talked about the presidential directive, and how many people have seen the presidential directive out here? Go get it, because there's an invitation in it to the the vendor community to participate with NARA in helping to design the tools and techniques of the future in order to help in this process. You guys can be pivotal to this.
Section A31.
Yeah, Section A31 of this. What would they Google to get that? What would be presidential directive or?
OMB NARA Records Directive.
OMB NARA Records Directive. Google that. Get that, read that section. There's an invitation for you guys. And we don't have to be prognosticating over what the future is. You guys can help make the future and participate in that. There's an absolutely open invitation out there to that, to the vendor community.
And also, just at the risk of spilling any beans about that, one of the things that we've spoken a lot about with ARMA about in some other organizations is the need for maybe some kind of a group to facilitate a lot of that and to make it easier for people to do that. So we're going to be announcing a coalition with ARMA and a number of other associations to do just what you're talking about after the first of the year. So, but don't put that in any tweets or press or anything.
The word's not out. Nobody raised their hand.
Yeah, don't put that out now. Listen, you guys are really candid, really appreciate it. Kevin and Steve and Mark, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.